Imagine a world where kings weren't just rulers, they were legends, their deeds carved into clay tablets and recited by firelight, shaping the beliefs of an entire civilization. That's the power of the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest stories, born in ancient Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago. This wasn't just a tale of adventure. It was a masterclass in influence, a way to teach loyalty, mortality, and the divine right of kings. Every time a storyteller raised their voice to recount Gilgamesh's quest, they weren't just entertaining a crowd, they were reinforcing the very fabric of society, binding people together under shared ideals and fears. But Mesopotamia was just the beginning. Across the ancient world, from the Nile to the Aegean, storytelling became a weapon sharper than any sword. Myths weren't mere folklore, they were tools of control, carefully crafted to justify laws, glorify rulers, and even wage wars. Think about it, when pharaohs claimed descent from the gods, or when Roman emperors rewrote history to paint themselves as saviors, they weren't just boasting, they were manipulating reality itself. These stories dictated who held power, who deserved obedience, and what truths people were willing to die for. So how did ancient civilizations turn storytelling into a force this potent? How did a well-spun myth become more powerful than an army? That's the mystery we're unraveling today. We'll journey through temples and scrolls, decoding the hidden tactics of Egyptian priests, Greek poets, and Roman propagandists, all masters of bending minds through narrative. And as we peel back the layers, you'll start to see eerie echoes in our own world, where media and messaging still shape beliefs with the same precision as those ancient fireside tales. This isn't just history, it's the playbook for influence, and you're about to learn how it was written. Long before kings carved their legends into stone, storytelling was already shaping human minds, etched not in words, but in ochre on cave walls. Picture this 30,000 years ago, in the flickering torchlight of Lascaux or Chauvet, our ancestors painted bison and hunters, not just as art, but as the first acts of narrative magic. These weren't mere decorations, they were primal lessons teaching survival, warning of dangers, and perhaps even summoning the spirits of the hunt. Shamans, the original storytellers, wielded these images like spells, turning fear into ritual and chaos into order. A lightning strike wasn't just weather. It was the anger of the gods, explained and controlled through tales whispered in the dark. This was myth as social glue. Without written laws or borders, early tribes relied on stories to define their identity. Why obey the chief? Why trust your neighbor? Because the ancestors said so. Their deeds and warnings lived on in oral sagas passed down for generations. The Australian Aboriginal Dreamtime, the Native American creation myths, the West African tales of Anansi the trickster, each served as a moral compass, reinforcing cooperation and punishing selfishness long before courts or prisons existed. But as villages grew into cities, rulers realized something profound. The same stories that united tribes could control empires. The shift was subtle. Oral tales became epic poems, cave paintings gave way to temple carvings. Now, instead of shamans explaining the harvest, priests declared that pharaohs were the sons of Ra, and Mesopotamian kings like Gilgamesh were 2/3 divine. Storytelling didn't just explain the world anymore, it justified hierarchy, making obedience feel sacred. The firepit circle had become a throne room, and the storyteller's voice now echoed with the weight of crowns. The Epic of Gilgamesh wasn't just entertainment, it was a carefully crafted blueprint for power. At its core, This 4,000-year-old Mesopotamian tale reinforced a simple but revolutionary idea. Kings weren't just men, they were destinies chosen. When scribes etched Gilgamesh's adventures onto clay tablets, they weren't merely recording a hero's journey, they were scripting the divine right of rulers. Here was a king who was two-thirds god, wrestling beasts and defying death itself. Ordinary people could never hope to match such grandeur, so why challenge his authority? The message was clear. Resistance wasn't just futile, it was unnatural. But the genius of the epic lies in its layers. Beyond the divine spectacle, it wove in universal human fears, especially our terror of being forgotten. Gilgamesh's desperate quest for immortality mirrored every citizen's deepest anxiety. The story's conclusion, true legacy comes not from personal glory, but from serving something greater, the city-state. Build walls, honor the gods, obey your king. That's how you cheat oblivion. It's no coincidence that scribes recited this epic during royal ceremonies. Each performance was a psychological masterstroke, turning loyalty into a sacred duty. Fast forward to today, and the playbook hasn't changed much. Modern leaders still wrap themselves in heroic narratives, whether it's wartime presidents framed as defenders of freedom or CEOs portrayed as visionary rebels. What were Mesopotamian scribes if not the original spin doctors? These literate elites controlled the narrative, editing tales to flatter patrons and justify wars. When they wrote that Gilgamesh defeated the demon Humbaba to protect his people, they were crafting the ancient equivalent of a press release after a military campaign. The medium has evolved from clay tablets to Twitter threads, but the goal remains identical: shape reality through story. What makes Gilgamesh so enduringly effective is its emotional alchemy. By blending divine spectacle with raw human vulnerability, it didn't just command obedience, it earned devotion. People didn't follow Gilgamesh because they feared his strength, they wept for his losses and cheered his triumphs. That's the dark art of political storytelling at its finest, when citizens stop seeing power as something imposed upon them and start seeing it as something they believe in. Egypt took Mesopotamia's storytelling playbook and elevated it to divine perfection. At the heart of their strategy was the myth of Osiris, murdered by his brother Set, resurrected by his wife Isis, and ruling eternally as lord of the underworld. But this wasn't just a tragic love story, it was the ultimate propaganda tool. Every pharaoh, from the moment they took the throne, became Horus, the avenging son of Osiris, destined to restore order. The message was unshakable: challenge the king, and you weren't just rebelling against a man, you were siding with chaos itself, like Set tearing Osiris apart. Temples became the billboards of this divine narrative. Walk into Karnak or Luxor, and you'd see walls crammed with hieroglyphs showing pharaohs smiting enemies under the watchful eyes of Ra or Ammon. These weren't decorations, they were psychological warfare. Picture a farmer, illiterate but awestruck, staring at those carvings. The images didn't need translation. The gods stood with the king, and his victories were preordained. Even death played its part. Pyramid texts, spells etched into royal tombs, promised the pharaoh would join the sun god's celestial boat, a VIP pass to eternity reserved only for those who ruled as living gods. But the real stroke of genius was the cult of the king. Festivals like the said Jubilee, held every 30 years, turned myth into live theater. Priests reenacted the Osiris story, with the pharaoh playing Horus, literally stomping on tiles representing enemy cities. The crowd didn't just watch, they ate, drank, and sang hymns binding them to the narrative. It was ancient viral marketing. Repeat a story often enough, with enough spectacle, and it becomes truth. Then came the Greeks, who took these divine blueprints and added a dangerous twist: democracy. Suddenly, myths weren't just tools for kings, they were weapons in the hands of citizens. Athenian playwrights like Aeschylus and Sophocles turned legends into political commentary, staging plays where gods and heroes debated justice, power, and the rights of the people. Imagine the subversion. In Egypt, stories flowed from temple to peasant. In Greece, they erupted from the agora, challenging authority as often as they upheld it. The game had changed, and with it, the rules of influence. Greece turned storytelling into a weapon of unity, and no text proves this better than Homer's Iliad. Picture the fractured world of ancient Greece, dozens of rival city-states, each with its own dialect, laws, and gods. Yet when bards recited the Iliad, they weren't just singing about Achilles' rage or Hector's courage, they were forging a shared identity. Troy became the ultimate other, a common enemy that made Greeks see themselves as one people despite their differences. The genius, Homer never mentions Greece as a nation. He calls them Achaeans, a tribal name that subtly rewired loyalty from local walls to a broader cultural bond. Heroes like Achilles and Odysseus weren't just characters, they were moral blueprints. Achilles embodied the ultimate warrior, proud, lethal, and driven by personal honor. His choices taught audiences the cost of unchecked individualism, as his withdrawal from battle doomed his comrades. Yet Odysseus offered a counterpoint, the clever strategist who won through wit rather than brute strength. Together, they gave Greeks a flexible code of conduct: need to inspire soldiers before battle, emphasize Achilles' glory, need to justify a diplomatic trick. Point to Odysseus' Trojan horse. Stories didn't just reflect values, they let societies pivot between ideals as needed. The Iliad's true power lay in its emotional alchemy. By humanizing enemies like Hector, a prince who kissed his infant son before facing certain death, Homer made victory bittersweet, not just triumphant. This nuance prevented Greek identity from hardening into blind hatred. Later nationalist movements would copy this tactic, painting rivals as noble foes to justify wars while keeping room for eventual peace. Fast forward to the Olympics, where city-states paused their feuds to compete under a shared Hellenic banner. The Iliad's legacy lived on not as a dusty poem, but as a living tool to balance fierce independence with collective pride. When Alexander the Great carried Homer's works into Persia, he wasn't just packing a favorite book, he was wielding the blueprint for how stories turn tribes into empires. Rome didn't just borrow Greece's storytelling playbook, they weaponized it on an imperial scale. Enter Virgil's Aeneid, the blockbuster epic commissioned by Emperor Augustus, not to entertain but to rewrite history itself. The premise was genius. Aeneas, a Trojan prince, flees the ashes of his homeland, guided by the gods to found a new kingdom in Italy. But this wasn't just a hero's journey, it was a carefully crafted origin myth, stitching Rome's rise into the fabric of divine will. Every battle, every sacrifice Aeneas endured served one purpose: to prove Rome's empire wasn't built on blood and conquest, but on destiny. Virgil's masterstroke was the character of pious Aeneas, a hero defined not by strength or cunning, but by obedience. When Aeneas carries his elderly father from burning Troy or abandons his lover Dido to fulfill his mission, the message was clear: duty to the state trumps personal desire. Augustus, fresh from decades of civil war, needed citizens to see submission as virtue, not weakness. The Aeneid framed Rome's brutal expansion as sacred labor, a burden shouldered not for glory, but because the gods demanded it. But the real power lay in performance. Imagine the forum packed with citizens, hanging on every word as poets recited Aeneas' trials. These weren't quiet readings, they were full-blown spectacles, with actors embodying characters and crowds chanting key lines. The Aeneid became a cultural echo chamber, its verses quoted in schools, etched onto monuments, even woven into legal arguments. When Augustus rebuilt Rome's temples and revived ancient rituals, he wasn't just restoring tradition. He was staging the Aeneid's divine backdrop in real time, making the myth feel as tangible as the marble underfoot. Religion supercharged this narrative alchemy. Roman gods weren't distant figures, they were political actors. Jupiter's prophecies in the Aeneid didn't just foreshadow events, they legitimized them. By tying Rome's fate to divine voices, Virgil turned skepticism into blasphemy. To question Augustus' wars was to defy the god's plan. It's no coincidence that the Aeneid's climax shows Aeneas' descendant, Romulus, destined to found Rome. Augustus, who claimed descent from Romulus, didn't just rule an empire, he fulfilled a celestial script written centuries before his birth. Yet the brilliance and danger of state-sponsored storytelling lies in its flexibility. The same epic that painted conquest as pious duty could also mask tyranny as protection. When Aeneas slays the Italian warrior Turnus, Virgil lingers on Turnus' pleading eyes before the fatal blow, a moment of humanity that complicates the hero's righteousness. Even propaganda, it seems, can't fully erase the cost of empire. Centuries later, we still grapple with this legacy. How easily stories of destiny can justify power, and how quickly faith can be drafted into service of a crown. Sacred texts didn't just record divine words, they engineered entire civilizations. Take the Code of Hammurabi, etched into a 2-meter-tall stele in Babylon around 1750 BC. At the top, the king stands before Shamash, god of justice, receiving the laws directly from divine hands. The message was unmistakable. These weren't human rules, but celestial decrees. Break them, and you weren't just defying the king, you were inviting cosmic punishment. This fusion of myth and law transformed obedience into a sacred act, weaving hierarchy into the very fabric of reality. Creation myths took this further, grounding social orders in the primordial past. In the Hindu Rig Veda, the Purusha Sukta describes the universe born from the sacrifice of a cosmic giant. His mouth became the priestly Brahmins, his arms the warrior Kshatriyas, his thighs the merchant Vaishyas, his feet the laboring Shudras. This wasn't poetry, it was a divine blueprint for caste, making inequality seem as natural as the sunrise. Over in Egypt, the Heliopolitan creation myth had Atum speaking the world into existence, his words manifesting as gods, then kings, then humans, each tier further from the source, each level owed deference. Rituals turned these stories into visceral experiences. The Hebrew Bible's Passover Seder wasn't just a meal, it was time travel, with participants tasting bitter herbs to relive the slavery of their ancestors. In Vedic fire sacrifices, priests chanted hymns while pouring ghee into flames, literally feeding the gods to maintain cosmic order. These weren't passive ceremonies, they were participatory theater, where every chant, gesture, and taste reinforced the underlying narrative. Rulers quickly realized religion's power as a political lever. When Constantine converted to Christianity in the 4th century, he didn't just adopt a faith, he co-opted its storytelling machinery. The Nicene Creed standardized belief, turning theological complexity into a unifying chant. Byzantine emperors later staged elaborate processions where relics of the true cross or saints' bones were paraded through Constantinople, transforming piety into imperial spectacle. Even the Maya kings of Mesoamerica performed ritual bloodletting, their suffering mirroring the gods' sacrifices in the Popol Vuh creation epic. By casting themselves as both priests and protagonists, they blurred the line between divine drama and earthly power. What made these sacred narratives so potent was their self-reinforcing design. A creation myth justified the king's rule. The king then funded temples to spread that myth. The temples trained priests to perform rituals that made the myth feel real. This wasn't just storytelling, it was a perpetual motion machine of belief, where every element propelled the others. Modern politicians still echo this playbook when they invoke divine destiny or frame policies as moral crusades. The medium has changed from stone steels to sound bites, but the alchemy remains the same. Weave identity, fear, and hope into a story, and you don't just lead people, you shape what they're willing to believe is possible. High atop the slopes of Mount Parnassus, the Oracle of Delphi, I didn't just predict the future, she shaped it. Pilgrims from across the ancient world climbed that sacred path, bearing gifts and trembling questions, but the priestess's answers were never straightforward. If you cross the Halys River, a great empire will fall, she told King Croesus of Lydia, who eagerly marched to war, only to realize too late that the doomed empire was his own. This wasn't mere fortune-telling, it was narrative judo using ambiguity as a weapon. The priests of Apollo knew the secret: give people just enough rope to hang themselves, and they'll call it destiny. Delphi's power lay in its perfect paradox. The oracle spoke in riddles, yes, but those riddles were backed by centuries of institutional credibility. When city-states debated war or colonization, they didn't just send generals, they dispatched treasuries to bribe the temple priests for favorable prophecies. The Spartans, masters of realpolitik, famously interpreted a prophecy to justify overthrowing their own kings. And when Athenian politicians needed public support for risky ventures, they'd suddenly discover ancient oracles predicting their success. The lesson: ambiguity isn't weakness, it's control. Let people believe they've decoded the truth, and they'll defend it as their own idea. Fast forward to today, and the game hasn't changed. Modern experts, economists, pollsters, even weather forecasters trade in the same careful uncertainty. Markets may correct if inflation persists, or studies suggest a potential trend could have been ripped straight from Delphi's playbook. The goal isn't to be right, it's to be flexible enough that any outcome reinforces your authority. Festivals turned these prophecies into living dogma. Every 4 years, the Pythian Games transformed Delphi into a sprawling stage where athletes, musicians, and orators performed under Apollo's gaze. Winners didn't just take home laurels, they carried stories back to their cities, weaving the oracle's prestige into local lore. Imagine an Athenian runner returning with tales of the gods' favor. Suddenly, his city's policies seemed divinely sanctioned. Ritualized repetition turned speculation into fact, and fact into fervor. The eerie brilliance of this system, it made manipulation feel like revelation. When Croesus's empire burned, the priests didn't lose credibility, they gained it. "See," whispered the faithful, "the oracle was right all along." Sound familiar? It's the same sleight of hand used by pundits who claim their predictions were misunderstood or algorithms tweaked after the fact. From Delphi's smoky chamber to today's spin rooms, the rule remains: control the narrative, and you don't just predict the future, you design it. The Dionysia festival in Athens wasn't just entertainment, it was a city-wide immersion into myth, where the lines between spectator and participant blurred. For days, the entire polis ground to a halt as citizens packed the theater of Dionysus, its stone seats carved into the Acropolis slope. But this wasn't passive viewing. When the chorus erupted into song, their masks tilted toward the crowd. The audience didn't just watch Oedipus unravel his fate. They lived it, gasping as he gouged his eyes, weeping as Antigone defied tyranny. These plays were emotional rehearsals, training citizens to equate suffering with pride and defiance with honor. The genius lay in the collective release. By crying together, Athenians reinforced what it meant to be Greek. Roman Saturnalia flipped the script literally. For one raucous week in December, slaves dined at their masters' tables and rulers served the ruled. Masks and role-playing turned society upside down, but here's the twist: this chaos had strict limits. When the festival ended, the old order snapped back, its authority refreshed by contrast. Like a pressure valve, Saturnalia didn't threaten power. It preserved it by letting steam escape in controlled bursts. Modern Halloween or Carnival echo this same bargain: temporary rebellion that ultimately reinforces the status quo. Theater and spectacle were just the beginning. Education locked these stories into minds before skepticism could take root. Greek boys memorized Homer not as literature, but as scripture, their very alphabet learned by copying lines about Achilles' wrath. Roman schoolchildren recited the Aeneid until its cadences pulsed in their veins, blurring the line between poetry and patriotism. Today's textbooks play a similar role, framing historical narratives that shape national identity. The difference: ancient teachers had no competing TikTok or Twitter to undermine their message. Their stories didn't just fill minds, they colonized them, leaving no room for rival tales to grow. What made these festivals and classrooms so potent was their sensory overload: the smell of roasting meat at Dionysia, the thunder of 1,000 voices chanting Aeneid's journey, the sting of a schoolmaster's rod driving home a verse. Reality wasn't just described, it was performed, tasted, and felt. Modern influencers chasing engagement are latecomers to a game the ancients mastered. The best stories don't just reach your audience. They rewrite their senses. In the dim lamplight of Mesopotamian scribble schools, students didn't just learn to write, they were drilled in the art of sanctioned memory. For hours each day, their reed styluses pressed into clay tablets, copying the same royal decrees, the same hymns to Enlil, the same exploits of Gilgamesh, until their hands ached and the stories became reflex. This wasn't education, it was cognitive architecture. By controlling which tales were transcribed and which vanished, Babylonian elites didn't just preserve culture, they curated reality. A missing battle here, an embellished divine favor there, and suddenly, history bent to fit the needs of the palace. The scribe's table was the first battlefield where myths were weaponized, and the casualties were alternative truths. Meanwhile, in Greece, two rival systems proved storytelling's flexibility. Sparta's agoge turned boys into living legends through brutal ritual. At night, around campfires, elders recited the deeds of Leonidas and Lycurgus not as distant heroes, but as blueprints. Every lash endured during the day was reframed by night as a chapter in their own heroic saga. Pain became honor, obedience, destiny. Contrast this with Athens, where philosophers like Socrates used dialogue to dissect myths in the agora. Why should we believe Odysseus was righteous, he'd ask, when his lies doomed his crew? Athenian education prized questioning, but even here, the state curated which questions were safe. Socrates' fatal cup of hemlock proved the limits of Athenian openness. Myth could be debated, but only so far. The true power of these systems lay in their generational reach. Mesopotamian scribes weren't just clerks, they were gatekeepers of orthodoxy, ensuring that every new administrator internalized the kingdom's divine narrative before they could so much as tally a grain shipment. Spartan elders didn't just train soldiers, they hardwired collective identity into boys who'd one day vote in the assembly. Education wasn't about knowledge, it was about allegiance. And once those neural pathways were carved by repetition and ritual, they became as unshakable as temple pillars. Art and architecture then cemented these lessons in stone and pigment. Walk through the Parthenon's shadow, and your eyes would meet metopes showing Greeks triumphant over centaurs, a visual shorthand for civilization conquering chaos. In Assyria, the walls of Nineveh screamed with reliefs of kings hunting lions, their muscles straining under the watchful gaze of winged deities. These weren't decorations, they were propaganda in perpetuity, hammering home messages that classrooms had already planted. When a Spartan boy traced his fingers over a statue of Heracles, he wasn't admiring art, he was touching his future self, the chilling brilliance of this system. It made indoctrination feel like discovery. By the time a student encountered dissent, the myths were already part of their emotional vocabulary, defended not just with logic, but with gut loyalty. Modern classrooms still grapple with this legacy, from national anthems recited before sports games to history textbooks that soften colonial violence. The medium has shifted from clay tablets to TikTok, but the goal remains eerily familiar. Whoever molds the stories of the young owns the future. Trajan's column spirals upward in Rome like a stone comic strip, each carved scene a carefully crafted frame in the emperor's conquest of Dacia. But this wasn't just art, it was ancient mass media designed to be read by citizens who'd never open a scroll. Illiterate farmers could glance at those marble panels and instantly grasp the story. Roman soldiers building bridges, Trajan mercifully pardoning foes, the gods themselves blessing his campaign. The column's genius, it turned military logistics into divine theater, where every engineering feat became proof of imperial destiny. No textbooks, no speeches, just images that bypassed reason and aimed straight for the gut. Egyptian tomb paintings worked similar magic. Walk into any noble's burial chamber, and you'd see the same motifs repeated. The deceased presenting offerings to Osiris, their fields overflowing with grain, their servants content. These weren't snapshots of real life, they were aspirational propaganda, showing a perfected world where the elite's rule kept chaos at bay. For peasants who'd never meet the pharaoh, these paintings were the ultimate branding proof that hierarchy meant harmony, and rebellion invited cosmic disaster. Fast forward to today, and the tactics feel familiar. National monuments like the Lincoln Memorial or Arc de Triomphe don't just honor heroes, they codify founding myths in marble. Corporate logos borrow from heraldry, with every swoosh or apple echoing the sigils medieval knights wore into battle. Even dissenters play by the same rules. When Banksy shreds his own painting at auction or protesters topple colonial statues, they're not just destroying objects, they're hacking the visual language of power, replacing one story with another. The real twist, ancient imagery had a built-in defense against counter-narratives. Egyptian artisans who painted tombs were state employees, their brushes monitored by viziers. Roman sculptors working on Trajan's column likely followed imperial sketchbooks. Control the artists and you control the myth, yet cracks still appeared. Look closely at some Theban tombs, and you'll find chisel marks where a worker subtly defaced a noble's likeness. Or notice how medieval scribes doodled rebellious monks in manuscript margins, tiny acts of sabotage in a war of symbols. What separates modern visual propaganda from its ancient roots isn't the method, but the speed. Trajan's column took years to carve. Today, a viral meme reshapes public opinion before lunch. Yet the goal remains unchanged, to make the stories of the powerful feel inevitable and the stories of the powerless invisible. The next time you pass a war memorial or a corporate logo, ask yourself what's being sold and who's holding the chisel. Aesop's fables weren't just bedtime stories, they were landmines disguised as children's tales. Think about The Wolf and the Lamb, where a predator fabricates excuses to devour his prey, or The Fox and the Grapes, where sour grapes become a metaphor for elite disdain. These weren't abstract lessons, They were veiled jabs at corrupt officials and hypocritical rulers, wrapped in the innocence of talking animals. Slave storytellers like Aesop couldn't openly criticize their masters, so they weaponized allegory. A slave might chuckle at the lion's share, where the king of beasts takes everything just like the aristocracy, but the joke carried a sting, the genius. Even if the powerful caught the subtext, punishing a fable about a greedy lion would only prove its point. Lucian of Samosata took this further, turning satire into a scalpel. In Dialogues of the Gods, he depicted Zeus as a bumbling bureaucrat and Hermes as a divine errand boy, reducing Olympus to a petty office. Roman elites paid to hear these performances, laughing at their own caricatures before realizing they'd been mocked. It was narrative jujitsu. The more Lucian stories spread as entertainment, the more they eroded reverence for authority. Marginalized groups perfected this stealth resistance. Enslaved Africans in the Americas spun Biara rabbit tales, where a small, clever trickster outwitted stronger foes, coded hope for the powerless. Jewish folklore gave us the golem, a clay protector born from persecution. Even fairy tales like Cinderella likely originated as working-class fantasies where kindness, not birthright, earned reward. These stories survived because they wore two faces: harmless fiction for the powerful, survival manuals for the oppressed. Today's underground media follows the same blueprint. Memes mocking politicians, protest songs streaming on TikTok, even graffiti parodying corporate logos. They're all descendants of Aesop's fables, using humor and symbolism to evade censorship. The difference: ancient subversive stories took generations to spread. Now they go viral before the powers that be can scrub them. Gender added another layer to this hidden war of narratives. For centuries, women's stories were dismissed as gossip or witchcraft until you look closer. The Greek poet Sappho's love lyrics were burned as scandalous, but her fragments survived in pottery shards and quotations. Medieval nuns like Hildegard of Bingen wrote visions that challenged papal authority, framing their descent as divine revelation. Even women's work, like weaving, hid subversion. Andean women encoded maps of sacred sites into textiles, preserving geography their colonizers tried to erase. What makes these counter-narratives so resilient is their camouflage. The same tale could be a children's fable to a king and a revolution manual to a slave. Modern activists still use this dual language strategy, hiding radical messages in pop songs or video games. The lesson: when you can't break the system outright, tell a story that cracks its foundation, one listener at a time. Pandora's box wasn't just a myth, it was a warning label stamped across an entire gender. In Hesiod's telling, the first woman was crafted by Zeus as punishment, her very existence a vessel for mankind's suffering. Every time ancient Greeks recited her story, they weren't explaining evil's origins, they were reinforcing a brutal equation: female curiosity equals catastrophe. Medusa's tale twisted the knife further. A beautiful maiden transformed into a monster after Poseidon assaulted her in Athena's temple. The message: female victims become threats, their power so dangerous it must be decapitated by heroes like Perseus. These weren't just stories, they were social blueprints, teaching generations that women's autonomy endangered the natural order. But patriarchy wasn't monolithic. For every Pandora, there was an Isis, Egypt's goddess, who resurrected her husband Osiris and ruled as divine queen. While Greek myths framed women as chaos agents, Egyptian hymns celebrated Isis's wisdom and magical prowess. Temples from Phila to Rome displayed her nursing Horus, an image later borrowed by Christianity for the Virgin and Child. Here was a narrative where female power wasn't contained, but revered as the glue holding cosmos and kingdom together. The contrast couldn't be starker. One culture's stories made womanhood synonymous with danger, another's made it divine. Trade routes became the hidden arteries pumping these conflicting narratives across borders. When Phoenician merchants carried statues of Astarte, a warrior goddess worshipped from Canaan to Carthage, they weren't just shipping cargo, they were smuggling alternate realities where women led armies and negotiated treaties. Viking traders spread tales of Freyja, who rode a boar into battle and claimed half the slain for her haul. Even in rigidly patriarchal societies, foreign stories created cracks in the orthodoxy. A Greek woman hearing of Isis's sovereignty or a Roman matron learning of Celtic warrior queens like Boudica found something dangerous: imagination fuel. The real power of these gender narratives lay in their choreography of daily life. In India, the Ramayana's Sita became the template for wifely devotion. Her Agni Pariksha trial by fire to prove her purity echoed in modern bridal rituals. China's Four Great Beauties myths taught that female allure could topple dynasties, making women scapegoats for political failures, yet counter-stories persisted. Japanese folktales like The Crane Wife celebrated female sacrifice but also hinted at its costs, the crane abandoning her human husband when he broke his promise. These weren't just plots, they were psychological shackles or lockpicks depending on who held the telling. Silk Road caravans and spice-laden ships ensured no narrative stayed pure. When Mesopotamian Ishtar's cult reached Greece, she merged with Aphrodite but kept her warlike traits, confusing gender expectations. Persian Scheherazade, spinning tales to save her life in the 1001 Nights, became a pan-Mediterranean symbol of female wit triumphing over male violence. The irony: trade networks built by merchants and monarchs became conduits for stories that undermined their own power structures. A Babylonian cylinder seal depicting Ishtar could wind up in a Macedonian girl's hands, planting seeds of rebellion in its carved celestial rays. What emerges is a hidden war of narratives, fought not with swords but with symbolism. Every culture had its Pandora but also its Isis, its Freyja, its subversive folktales whispered after dark. The stories that survived weren't necessarily the truest, but the ones that served someone's interest. Today's gender debates still play out on this ancient battlefield, where every Disney princess or feminist retelling is just the latest volley in a war of myths millennia in the making. A caravan creaks across the Taklamakan Desert, its camels laden not just with silks and spices, but with something far more potent: stories. Along the Silk Road, Buddhist monks traveling from Gandhara to China carried illustrated scrolls of the Jatakas, tales of the Buddha's past lives. But something fascinating happened when these stories met Greek settlers in Central Asia. The Buddha's previous incarnations began to resemble the labors of Hercules. In the Greco-Buddhist art of Afghanistan, a bodhisattva might be depicted with the muscular physique of a Hellenic hero, his enlightenment journey framed like an epic quest. This wasn't accidental, it was narrative alchemy, blending cultures to make foreign ideas palatable. Merchants quickly realized that stories could cross borders even when armies couldn't. A trader might not convince a Chinese official to buy Roman glass, but a parable about a generous merchant reborn as a king that could open doors and minds. The Silk Road's greatest weapon wasn't the sword but the parable. Take the Panchatantra, an ancient Indian collection of animal fables. Translated into Persian as Kalila Wadimna, these tales traveled west, morphing into Aesop's fables in Greece and later inspiring La Fontaine's French adaptations. Each retelling softened the story's origins, making it feel local while smuggling in foreign values. A fox outwitting a lion in India became a lesson about outsmarting tyrants in Baghdad, then a satire of French aristocracy. The real power lay in the illusion of familiarity. No one resents a story that feels like their own. even if it's reshaping their world, you one metaphor at a time. Yet this cultural exchange had a darker edge. When Alexander the Great's successors built Greek-style cities in Bactria, they didn't just import columns and theaters, they brought the myth of Heracles, rebranding him as Vajrapani, the thunderbolt-wielding protector of the Buddha. Conquerors understood that statues could colonize minds more effectively than garrisons. Fast forward to today, and the playbook hasn't changed. Hollywood blockbusters reframe foreign history through Western lenses, while streaming algorithms quietly prioritize certain narratives over others. Call it media imperialism or soft power, either way, it's the Silk Road strategy digitized and scaled. The most chilling twist, some stories were designed as psychological Trojan horses. The Chinese Buddhist monk Xuanzang recorded how Central Asian kings sponsored monasteries not just for piety, but to pacify populations, teach people that suffering is karma from past lives, and they'll accept inequality as destiny. Spanish conquerors later used the same tactic in the Americas, grafting Christian saints onto indigenous deities to make subjugation feel holy. Stories didn't just cross borders, they dissolved them, rewriting collective memory until resistance seemed unthinkable. But here's the paradox: the very networks that spread oppressive narratives also seeded resistance. Along those same trade routes, Sufi poets whispered verses about divine love transcending dogma, while Zen masters taught that enlightenment required no temples at all. The Silk Road stories were a double-edged sword, and today's digital highways follow the same dangerous, dazzling pattern. One tweet, one meme, one viral tale can topple empires or build them, just as it did 2,000 years ago under desert stars. The Assyrians didn't just conquer cities, they weaponized nightmares. Walk through the ruins of Nineveh's royal palaces, and the walls scream silently with scenes of flayed rebels, impaled prisoners, and defeated kings dragged by hooks through their own streets. These weren't private records, they were propaganda in stone, strategically placed where foreign envoys and local subjects couldn't look away. Every gory detail served a purpose: to make defiance feel futile. When an Assyrian sculptor depicted a captured ruler forced to grind his father's bones, he wasn't documenting history, he was scripting fear into the collective memory. The message was clear: resistance wouldn't just fail, it would erase your lineage from existence. Aztec codices took this further, turning terror into theology. Their creation myths taught that the sun god Huitzilopochtli needed constant human blood to battle the darkness, a divine demand that justified thousands of sacrifices. But the real psychological mastery lay in the spectacle. Victims marched up temple steps adorned as gods, treated as honored guests before their hearts were offered to the sky. This wasn't random brutality. It was ritualized theater, where every participant, from the priest with the obsidian blade to the crowd below, played a role in affirming the cosmic order. To question the system wasn't just treason, it risked plunging the world into eternal night. Yet fear alone couldn't sustain empires. For every horror story, rulers paired tales of protection. Egyptian pharaohs didn't just threaten chaos, they promised prosperity under their divine guardianship. Temple murals showed them smiting enemies, yes, but also presenting sheaves of wheat to grateful farmers. The Hindu epic Mahabharata balanced its battle scenes with parables about dharma, teaching that righteous rulers shielded their people from not just invaders, but famine and injustice. Terror might force obedience, but only hope could inspire loyalty. Beneath the blood and glory, though, stories hid something more practical: survival manuals. Inuit elders didn't just entertain with tales of Sedna the sea goddess, they encoded Arctic fishing wisdom in her underwater taboos. Aboriginal songlines mapped water sources across the desert in melodies. Even Grimm's fairy tales, with their dark forests and hungry wolves, taught medieval children the dangers of straying too far from the village. The most enduring myths weren't just about control, they were lifelines, distilling generations of hard-won knowledge into narratives too memorable to forget. What emerges is a double helix of influence, one strand coiled with threats, the other with promises. Modern governments still dance this same ancient rhythm, terror alerts paired with pledges of security, dystopian warnings balanced by visions of progress. The medium has shifted from temple carvings to news cycles, but the calculus remains unchanged. To rule minds, you must first master the stories that feed both their deepest fears and their highest hopes. For the Aboriginal peoples of Australia, every twist in a river or cluster of rock formations wasn't just landscape, it was a chapter in an epic sung for millennia. Dreamtime stories did more than explain creation. They functioned as living maps, encoding survival knowledge in narrative form. Take the tale of the rainbow serpent, whose winding path carved out rivers and waterholes as it moved across the land. To outsiders, it's a myth, but to initiates, it's a hydrological blueprint, a reminder that valleys follow water and certain rock formations signal underground springs. Elders didn't just recite these stories around campfires, they walked the routes with younger generations, turning song lines into GPS. A single verse might describe the exact location of a seasonal fruit grove or a sandstone overhang perfect for shelter during monsoons. This wasn't folklore, it was geospatial intelligence wrapped in sacred verse, ensuring critical knowledge survived even if written language didn't. Half a world away, Viking skalds performed similar feats of information preservation. Norse sagas like The King's Mirror didn't just glorify battles, they packed navigational wisdom into poetic stanzas. A description of Thor's journey might hide clues about using polarized light to locate the sun on cloudy days, or how migratory bird patterns signaled proximity to land. When the saga mentions the whale's road, it's not just metaphor, it's a mnemonic for recognizing ocean currents by the behavior of marine life. These stories were so precise that modern researchers have retraced Viking routes using saga descriptions alone, finding hidden anchorages and trade ports exactly where the verses suggested. The genius of these systems, they made memorization effortless. Disaster preparedness myths from Japan to the Andes follow the same pattern. In Tohoku, parents still teach children tsunami tendenko, a folk saying urging immediate flight to high ground after earthquakes, no matter what. It's not a government slogan, it's a rhyming couplet passed down since the 890 Jogan tsunami. Similarly, Native American flood stories like the Choctaws' Great Serpent's Fury specify which mountain ridges remain dry during catastrophic rains. When knowledge is wrapped in story, it bypasses skepticism and lodges in the gut. But stories didn't just preserve survival tactics, they built economies. Consider the Pacific Northwest's potlatch ceremonies, where chiefs gave away wealth in competitive feasts. To European colonizers, it looked like waste, but the rituals were economic engines in disguise. By weaving property rights, debt obligations, and resource distribution into dramatic performances, coastal tribes maintained complex trade networks without written contracts. A single potlatch could redistribute years' worth of accumulated goods, with stories ensuring everyone remembered who owed what. Modern stock markets and copyright laws are just potlatches in suits, using narratives of shareholder value or intellectual property to justify systems that would collapse without collective belief. From Aboriginal songlines to Wall Street quarterly reports, the pattern holds. The stories we tell about resources determine who gets to eat, who gets rich, and who gets left behind. The next time you hear a fairy tale about buried treasure or a corporate origin story, listen closer. You might just hear the rustle of survival manuals rewritten for a new age. In the baked clay tablets of Mesopotamia, kings didn't just cancel debts, they scripted miracles. Every few decades, rulers like Hammurabi would declare Anjurarum, wiping the slate clean for debt-ridden farmers. But this wasn't mere economic policy, it was storytelling genius. Royal scribes framed these acts as divine interventions, with proclamations like Shamash the sun god has commanded justice. The reality, these resets prevented revolts when inequality grew too stark, yet the language transformed cold calculus into sacred duty. Farmers kneeling before the erased ledger weren't just relieved, they were reverent, convinced their king communed with the gods to spare them. Modern stimulus checks or corporate bailouts follow the same playbook. Crisis relief wrapped in narratives of national solidarity or job creator benevolence, making systemic fixes feel like gifts rather than rights. Meanwhile, along the Indus River, Hindu Dharma Shastras wove a different economic tale. The Purusha Sukta hymn didn't just describe caste divisions, it sang them into cosmic inevitability. Brahmin priests emerged from the cosmic being's mouth, warriors from his arms, merchants from thighs, and laborers from feet. This wasn't poetry, it was a metaphysical justification for who got to think, who fought, who traded, and who toiled. By linking social roles to the very anatomy of creation, the story made questioning one's position akin to rejecting the universe's design. Fast forward to Victorian England, where industrialists quoted Adam Smith's invisible hand like scripture, or today's Silicon Valley mantra that disruption justifies upheaval. Every era has its Varna tales, dressing inequality as natural law. The courtroom, too, became a stage for economic theater. Babylonian judges invoked Ishtar's wisdom when ruling on property disputes, just as medieval European courts cited biblical parables about fair wages. But the real power lay in who controlled the storytelling. When Roman emperors minted coins proclaiming abundantia with cornucopias overflowing, they weren't documenting reality. They were scripting it, turning bread dole lines into symbols of imperial generosity. Modern central banks do much the same when inflation reports get buried under press releases about resilient growth. What makes these narratives so potent is their alchemy, transforming exploitation into tradition, extraction into destiny. A Mesopotamian peasant singing hymns to his debt-relieving king, or a gig worker applauding flexibility over benefits, both live inside stories they didn't write. The difference: ancient myths were carved in stone for all to see, while today's economic tales hide in spreadsheets and slogans, their foundations just as mythical and twice as hard to challenge. Hammurabi's code wasn't just a list of laws, it was a story carved in stone, literally. At the top of that towering diorite stele, the Babylonian king stands before Shamash, the sun god of justice, receiving the laws directly from divine hands. This wasn't just symbolism, it was a masterclass in narrative framing. Every citizen who approached the stele, even if they couldn't read the cuneiform, understood the visual message. These rules didn't come from a man, but from the cosmos itself. Break them and you weren't just defying Hammurabi, you were challenging the order of the universe. The laws themselves reinforced this mythos. An eye for an eye wasn't mere brutality, it was cosmic balance, a tale where every crime disrupted harmony and every punishment restored it. Even the code structure told a story, starting with property laws and ascending to human rights, mirroring the Babylonian belief in a tiered universe where order flowed downward from the gods. Compare this to Athens, where justice wasn't handed down from a stele but performed in open-air theaters. Greek trials were dramatic spectacles, with citizens serving as both jury and audience. Defendants didn't hire lawyers, they hired speechwriters, turning legal defenses into gripping narratives. Take the trial of Socrates. His accusers painted him as a corrupter of youth, while he cast himself as a gadfly stinging a lazy horse, the state. The verdict wasn't just about guilt, it was about which story the jury found more compelling. Even the setting, the agora, surrounded by temples and statues of gods, made every trial feel like a moral parable unfolding in real time. Rome took a colder, more systematic approach. Legal precedents were recorded in the 12 tables, but the real power lay in the stories behind them. When a Roman jurist cited a case from 2 centuries prior, he wasn't just referencing law, he was invoking a lineage of wisdom, a chain of decisions stretching back to the founding of the Republic. The Mos Maiorum, the way of the ancestors, wasn't just tradition. It was a binding narrative that made change feel like sacrilege. Emperors like Augustus exploited this brilliantly, wrapping their radical reforms in tales of restoring ancient virtues. The law didn't just regulate behavior, it curated memory, ensuring every new edict felt like a return to some golden age. But the darkest twist came when these legal stories hit the road. Roman conquest wasn't just about legions and loot, it was about exporting narratives. In Gaul, local chiefs who resisted were crucified along roadsides as warnings, while those who cooperated received Roman citizenship, and with it, a new identity woven into the empire's founding myths. The same playbook echoed in British colonial courts, where English common law was imposed as civilization, and in Spanish encomiendas, where forced labor was justified through biblical parables of stewardship. The most effective conquerors understood, you don't just change laws, you change the stories people tell about what justice even means. Today's legal systems still dance to these ancient rhythms. Supreme Court justices quote centuries-old precedents like oracles, while viral courtroom moments turn trials into modern dramas. The difference, now we see the strings, the way narratives shape verdicts, the way law and order can mask oppression or inspire reform. The next time you hear a politician invoke the founders or a lawyer spin a closing argument, listen closely. You're not just hearing a case, you're hearing the latest chapter in a story that began with a king and a god chiseled into stone. When Romulus killed Remus and drew his sacred boundary around the Palatine Hill, he wasn't just founding a city, he was writing the ultimate colonial script. Rome's origin myth, with its divine twins and wolf-suckled kings, served a brutal purpose. It turned conquest into destiny. Every time Roman generals marched into Gaul or Egypt, they weren't invading. They were reuniting lands supposedly destined for Roman rule since time began. Virgil's Aeneid doubled down on this, tracing Rome's lineage back to the Trojan prince Aeneas, whose wanderings were guided by Jupiter himself. By the time Augustus ruled, the story had hardened into dogma. Rome didn't take empires, it inherited them like a birthright woven into the stars. Centuries later, Spanish friars in Mesoamerica performed an even darker alchemy. After burning thousands of Mayan codices, they rewrote the few surviving texts, but with a twist. The Popol Vuh, the K.H. Maya's sacred creation story, was transcribed by Dominican friar Francisco Ximenes, who inserted Christian themes into its cosmology. Suddenly, the hero twins Hunahpu and Xbalanque weren't just outwitting lords of the underworld, they were unwitting prophets of Christ, their trials reframed as steps toward Christian revelation. Indigenous artists forced to paint church murals blended Quetzalcoatl's feathers with angel wings, making colonialism feel less like erasure and more like fulfillment. It was narrative genocide, not just destroying stories, but repurposing them as Trojan horses for foreign rule. Yet these tactics aren't relics. Walk through any former British colony, and you'll find schools where Shakespeare is taught as universal, while local epics are shelved as folklore. Modern museums still display looted artifacts under labels that describe conquest as contact and resistance as rebellion. The language has softened, but the blueprint remains. Control the past story, and you control the present's power structure. But here's where the plot twists. Just as colonialists rewrote histories, the colonized smuggled counter-narratives like contraband. Aztec scribes hidden in Spanish monasteries painted codices showing Cortés not as a conqueror, but as a fool stumbling into traps. The Maori kept their ancestral stories alive through Whakapapa genealogies, recited in secret under British rule. Today, activists from Standing Rock to Palestine use social media to bypass traditional gatekeepers, flooding TikTok with indigenous creation myths or Instagram with decolonized history threads. The battleground has shifted from clay tablets to algorithms, but the war is the same whose stories get to define what's real. What Rome and Spain grasped and what modern powers still fear is this: the pen might be mighty, but the story is immortal. The Viking skald didn't just recite poetry, he reshaped it with every performance. Picture a firelit hall in 9th century Norway, where a single saga about Thor's fishing trip could change based on the audience, emphasize the god's strength for warriors, his cunning for traders, his humor for a feast. Skalds weren't human recorders, they were narrative alchemists tweaking verses to suit kings, flirt with patrons, or even mock rivals through sly double meanings. This wasn't chaos, it was control through flexibility. A story that could bend was a story that could survive, adapting to new rulers, new religions, new worlds without ever breaking. Compare that to the Bible's unyielding parchment. Once Jerome's Latin Vulgate was standardized in the 4th century, every jot and tittle became immutable, turning living oral traditions into frozen doctrine. The difference: a skald could tweak a verse to flatter a Christian convert king without losing his head, while a medieval scribe altering scripture risked being branded a heretic. Writing didn't just preserve stories, it petrified them, handing power to those who controlled the pen. Yet some cultures weaponized orality against this very rigidity. West African griots, the living libraries of the Mali Empire, could recite genealogies stretching back centuries, but their true power lay in selective silence. A griot might forget a king's embarrassing defeat during a performance, or subtly emphasize an ancestor's generosity when a stingy noble was listening. Druids in Celtic Britain took this further. They outright refused to write down their knowledge, forcing Roman invaders to rely on biased accounts from enemies. By keeping wisdom in their heads, they made it impossible to confiscate or censor. When Julius Caesar wrote about Druidic rituals, he wasn't documenting truth, he was guessing, and the Druids knew it. Their stories weren't just history, they were an act of resistance, a way to ensure that no conqueror could ever fully own their past. Archaeology now reveals how deeply these storytelling battles shaped civilizations. In Sweden, runestones show Viking sagas evolving from pagan incantations to Christian prayers, within a generation proof of skalds adapting to survive. Meanwhile, in Timbuktu, researchers found griot families had secretly preserved pre-Islamic epics in their oral repertoires for centuries, despite jihadist campaigns to burn unholy texts. Even the physical objects tell tales. Irish Ogham stones carved with Druidic script often face away from Roman roads, as if turning their backs on imperial eyes. The real twist: written texts, for all their control, often betray their own fragility. Scribes' marginal notes in medieval Bibles reveal debates about correct verses, while palimpsests' parchments scraped clean of older texts show doctrine literally overwriting dissent. Oral traditions, though fluid, could be more tenacious. A griot song or skald's verse, unshackled from parchment, could hide in plain sight for generations, waiting for the right moment to resurface. The next time you hear a fairy tale or folk song, listen closer. You might be hearing the echoes of a battle between the storytellers who refused to be silenced and the powers that tried to freeze truth in ink. When the Rosetta Stone cracked open the secrets of hieroglyphs in 1822, it didn't just translate words, it exposed a 2,000-year-old propaganda campaign. The stone itself was a Ptolemaic press release, carved in 196 BCE, proclaiming Pharaoh Ptolemy V as a divine benefactor who lowered taxes and restored temples. But here's the twist. Identical decrees were found across Egypt, each claiming local priests spontaneously voted to honor the king, the Rosetta Stone's real revelation. It proved even ancient rulers ran coordinated media blitzes, mass-producing narratives to cement power. Modern politicians boasting about unanimous support or grassroots movements are just recycling Ptolemy's playbook, except he had the decency to carve his spin in stone. Maya rulers took myth-making even further, turning stone stelae into Instagram feeds of the classical era. Walk through Tikal or Palenque, and you'll see towering monuments where kings like Jasorchan Kayawil posed mid-victory, trampling enemies underfoot while gods leaned down to crown them. But archaeologists noticed something suspicious. Dates on these stelae often overlapped with rival city-states' victory records. It turns out Maya scribes were masters of selective editing, omitting defeats, inflating triumphs, and even retroactively erasing disgraced rulers from genealogies. One Palenque stela famously claims King Pakal lived to 99, but skeletal analysis suggests he died in his 40s. The lesson: when history is written by the winners, even stone can lie. Fast forward to the James ossuary, a 1st century limestone box that made headlines in 2002 for its inscription, "James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus." The artifact seemed like a biblical bombshell until forensic linguists noticed the second half of the inscription had a different patina, suggesting modern tampering. Suddenly, a relic that promised to rewrite religious history became a cautionary tale about how easily stories are weaponized. Whether it's a 2,000-year-old bone box or a viral tweet, the pattern holds: artifacts don't speak for themselves. Someone always holds the chisel. The most insidious narratives aren't the obvious falsehoods, but the ones that shape what we consider true. For centuries, European scholars dismissed Mesoamerican codices as primitive myths, while treating Greek legends as proto-history. Only when Maya glyphs were deciphered in the 1980s did we grasp their astronomical precision calendars predicting eclipses centuries in advance, far surpassing contemporary European knowledge. Even science isn't immune. Darwin's survival of the fittest was co-opted by colonialists to justify racism, while medieval alchemists' tales of transmutation paved the way for modern chemistry. Stories don't just record progress, they dictate its direction, elevating some truths and burying others. Dig deep enough into any fact, and you'll find a myth waiting to be told. The Babylonians didn't just map the stars, they turned the night sky into a celestial ledger of power. Their Enuma Anu Enlil, a sprawling collection of 70 clay tablets, wasn't just an astronomical record. It was a divine playbook linking planetary movements to earthly events. When Venus appeared in a certain constellation, priests declared it a sign favoring royal decrees. A lunar eclipse that signaled divine wrath requiring immediate sacrifices, conveniently overseen by the king's temple. This wasn't science as we know it. It was narrative control disguised as cosmology. By monopolizing celestial interpretation, Babylonian elites made the heavens themselves endorse their rule. Farmers who might question taxes couldn't argue with Jupiter's position after all. The gods had spoken through the stars. Egypt's pyramids took this celestial storytelling to architectural extremes. The Great Pyramid of Giza doesn't just align with the cardinal directions with near-perfect precision. Its air shafts point directly to Orion's belt and Sirius, stars linked to Osiris and Isis. This wasn't an engineering fluke. It was a stone manifesto declaring pharaohs didn't just rule Egypt, they joined the cosmos after death. During the annual Nile flood, when Sirius reappeared after months of invisibility, priests staged ceremonies where the pharaoh's voice echoed through temple corridors, miraculously synced with the stars rising. The message, the king's authority, pulsed through the universe itself, as reliable as the seasons. Yet the Greeks ripped this celestial script to shreds. When Thales predicted a solar eclipse in 585 BC, he didn't attribute it to divine whim. He used geometry. Suddenly, the heavens weren't a priestly monopoly, but a puzzle anyone could solve. Myths like Icarus's flight or Orion's constellation became public property, debated in agora symposia alongside philosophy and politics. Aristarchus of Samos even proposed a heliocentric solar system centuries before Copernicus, an idea too radical for his time, but proof that Greek storytelling had cracked open the cosmos. No longer was the sky a royal decree, it was a democratic dialogue. This celestial storytelling didn't just shape politics, it dictated life and death. Babylonian medical texts prescribed remedies based on zodiac signs, while Egyptian doctors timed surgeries to lunar phases. The Greek Hippocratic corpus, though pioneering empirical medicine, still advised bleeding patients during safe planetary hours. Even today, hospital studies note spikes in births during full moons not because of gravity, but because centuries of lunar lore still subconsciously guide behavior. The stories we tell about the stars don't just map galaxies, they wire our brains, turning ancient myths into modern instincts. From Babylonian ziggurats to modern horoscopes, the pattern holds. Whoever controls the sky story controls the minds below. The difference: today's astrologers don't need clay tablets, just a viral tweet about Mercury retrograde can send millions into panic. Some narratives are so powerful, they outlast the empires that invented them. Hippocrates didn't just practice medicine, he rewrote its origin story. In ancient Greece, where illness was often blamed on angry gods or demonic possession, the Hippocratic corpus made a radical claim: disease had natural causes. But this wasn't just science, it was narrative warfare. Take the famous tale of the sacred disease, epilepsy, which temple priests called a divine curse. Hippocrates countered with a detailed account of brain malfunctions, framing seizures as biology, not punishment. His genius lay in storytelling. Case studies read like detective dramas, tracing symptoms to environmental factors or lifestyle choices. Suddenly, healing wasn't about appeasing deities, it was about observation, logic, and the patient's own story. Yet even here, myth lurked beneath the surface. The Hippocratic Oath itself invoked Apollo and Asclepius, blending empirical methods with just enough tradition to make the pill of progress easier to swallow. Meanwhile, in the forests of the Indus Valley, Ayurvedic sages wove a different kind of healing tapestry. The Charaka Samhita, a foundational text, didn't separate body from spirit. It described health as a dance between doshas, energies, seasons, and even moral conduct. A fever wasn't just an infection. It could stem from unresolved anger, imbalanced fire energy, or disrespecting the rhythms of nature. These narratives weren't primitive guesses. They were sophisticated systems where diet, yoga, and meditation aligned the microcosm of the self with the macrocosm of the universe. When a practitioner prescribed turmeric for inflammation, they didn't just cite its anti-inflammatory properties, they recounted myths of the sun god, gifting its golden hue to purify blood. Science and symbolism became inseparable, turning prescriptions into parables. Fast forward to today's placebo effect. the ghost in the machine of modern medicine. A sugar pill can ease pain if the patient believes it's powerful, proving that healing narratives still wield real biological force. Clinical trials now measure the story behind treatments. Blue pills work better as sedatives than red ones because we associate color with calm. Surgeons find patients recover faster when told, "This procedure will help you," rather than, "You might feel discomfort." These aren't quirks, they're echoes of ancient spells and chants, where words themselves were medicine. The difference, now we call it neurobiology instead of magic, but the mechanism remains the same. The stories we tell about healing can rewrite our flesh. Yet the darkest healing narratives weren't about curing, they were about exclusion. Medieval Europeans blamed Jews for poisoning wells during the Black Death, while Renaissance witch hunts targeted midwives whose herbal knowledge threatened male physicians. Even Hippocrates' legacy had a shadow. His theory of the wandering womb labeled women's hysteria as biological inferiority, a myth that lingered for millennia. Healing stories could mend, but they could also divide, turning the sick into scapegoats and healers into heretics. From Hippocratic casebooks to modern clinical trials, one thread endures: illness is never just a physical fact. It's a story we tell about our bodies, our failures, our place in the world. And like all stories, it can liberate or enslave, depending on who holds the pen. When Herodotus described the Persians as barbarians in his histories, he wasn't just using a word. He was building a mental border between civilization and chaos. The term itself came from Greek mockery of foreign speech, barbar, sounding like nonsensical chatter, but it grew into something far more potent. Persian kings like Xerxes weren't just rivals. They became archetypal villains, their armies painted as faceless hordes enslaved to a despotic god-king. Never mind that Persia's Achaemenid Empire pioneered human rights declarations and religious tolerance centuries before Greece. The story demanded a savage foil to Athenian democracy's brilliance. This narrative reached its peak in 300 BC when Greek playwrights staged The Persians, showing Xerxes weeping over his defeat at Salamis, a spectacle designed to make Athenian audiences feel both superior and united against an existential threat. Christian missionaries perfected this villain-making machinery when they encountered pagan Europe, Thor's mighty hammer redefined as a demon's weapon. Phrygia's fertility magic recast as witchcraft, the Celts' horned god Cernunnos morphed into Satan himself, complete with cloven hooves. This wasn't accidental symbolism, it was systematic narrative colonization. By grafting pagan imagery onto Christian concepts of evil, missionaries turned conversion into a battle of cosmic good versus absolute darkness. A Viking hearing the gospel didn't just adopt a new faith. He learned his ancestors' gods were monsters all along, making apostasy feel like awakening from a collective nightmare. Modern politics still runs on this ancient playbook. Immigrants become invasions, political opponents, enemies of the people, and foreign policies, clashes of civilizations. The difference: today's xenophobic tropes wear statistical masks, graphs about job theft or cultural erosion that play the same emotional chords as Greek vase paintings of Persians in servile postures. Yet these villain myths had a paradoxical brilliance. They forged unity through shared peril. When plague struck medieval Europe, Jews became scapegoats not because they caused the Black Death, but because blaming an other gave fractured societies a common enemy to rally against. The same mechanism powered Cold War space races. Sputnik wasn't just a satellite. It was a Soviet barbarian at democracy's gates, spurring unprecedented scientific cooperation in the West. What makes these narratives so dangerously effective is their emotional alchemy. A story that paints outsiders as threats doesn't just describe conflict, it manufactures solidarity through manufactured fear. The next time you hear a tale of us versus them, listen closely. You might just hear Herodotus whispering across 2,500 years, proving some stories never die, they just update their costumes. When the waters rose in ancient Mesopotamia, they didn't just flood fields, they flooded the collective memory. The epic of Gilgamesh's deluge story, carved into clay tablets over 4,000 years ago, wasn't just a myth, it was a survival manual wrapped in sacred verse. Utnapishtim, the Noah of this older tale, doesn't just build an ark, he receives precise architectural instructions, saves craftsmen and animals, and releases birds to test the receding waters. These weren't poetic flourishes, they were actionable protocols disguised as legend. Every time the story was recited, it drilled disaster preparedness into listeners' minds. Store grain high, choose durable materials, prioritize useful skills. The narrative's genius, it made resilience feel like divine mandate rather than bureaucratic chore. Compare this to the biblical Noah, where the flood becomes moral reckoning. The Ark story in Genesis tightens Gilgamesh's blueprint with ethical stakes. Wickedness triggers the deluge, and righteousness earns salvation. But the practical wisdom remains. Note how Noah preserves biodiversity by carrying paired animals, or how the Rainbow Covenant afterward reframes storms not as arbitrary wrath, but as manageable cycles. These stories didn't just explain disasters, they scripted responses, turning chaos into a test humanity could theoretically pass. Phoenix symbolism took this further, transforming destruction into rebirth. Egyptian and Greek myths of the fiery bird rising from ashes weren't mere metaphors, they were cognitive tools for societies shattered by war or famine. After Rome burned in 64 CE, Emperor Nero didn't just rebuild. He minted coins with phoenix imagery, binding urban renewal to cosmic renewal. The message: catastrophe wasn't an end, but a necessary purge before renewal. Modern post-war reconstruction campaigns, from Hiroshima's peace parks to Dresden's rebuilt Frauenkirche, unconsciously echo this ancient trope, framing rubble as the raw material for redemption. Today's obsession with apocalypse prep, from zombie survival guides to Silicon Valley billionaires' bunkers, proves these narratives still shape us. Prepper forums quote Noah's Ark as the original bug-out plan, while climate change reports borrow the literary structure of flood myths. Warnings ignored, tipping points reached, last chances offered. The medium has shifted from cuneiform to Netflix dystopias, but the psychological function remains identical. Stories don't just predict doom, they give us scripts to endure it. What ancient mythmakers understood, and we're relearning, is that resilience isn't just about supplies or shelters. It's about stories that fuse fear with agency, that transform survivors into protagonists rather than victims. When a Mesopotamian parent told their child about Utnapishtim, they weren't just passing down folklore, they were installing mental software to navigate the next crisis. That's the untold legacy of these tales. They didn't just survive history, they helped people survive it. The viral meme you scrolled past this morning has more in common with ancient campfire tales than you might think. Think about how quickly a trending hashtag spreads within hours. Millions are repeating the same phrases, inside jokes or challenges, just as generations once passed down folktales through oral tradition. The mechanics are identical. Repetition breeds familiarity, and familiarity breeds belief. Whether it's a Babylonian proverb carved into clay or a TikTok sound bite looping on smartphones, the human brain is wired to absorb stories through sheer exposure. The difference: where elders once curated which tales survived, algorithms now decide what goes viral, optimizing not for wisdom but for clicks. Political slogans, too, are recycled from antiquity's playbook. Rome's SPQR, Senatus Populus Romanus, wasn't just an abbreviation. It was a narrative shorthand, fusing Senate and people into a single, unbreakable identity. Modern equivalents like "Make America Great Again" or "Yes We Can" function the same way, condensing complex ideologies into mythic mantras. These phrases don't just communicate ideas, they trigger emotional archetypes. The red cap of a MAGA supporter mirrors the purple cloaks of Roman senators, both costumes signaling tribal allegiance. The slogans stick because they tap into something older than politics, the human craving for belonging, packaged as a story simple enough to chant. Algorithms now wield the power once reserved for Delphi's oracle. Ancient pilgrims sought clarity from priestesses who spoke in riddles. Today, we type questions into search bars and accept the top result as truth. Both systems thrive on ambiguity. Personalized feeds show each user a slightly different reality, just as the oracle's prophecies could be twisted to fit any outcome. The danger isn't just misinformation, it's the illusion of choice. You might believe you're exploring ideas freely, but every recommended video or trending topic is the result of invisible curation, steering culture like priests once guided empires. The stories we consume today are no less influential than the epics of old. They're just harder to recognize as myths. A celebrity feud framed as a cosmic battle of good versus evil, a brand origin story scrubbed of labor abuses, a national holiday that glosses over genocide, all are modern legends shaping how we see the world. The challenge now is to pause mid-scroll and ask, who benefits from this narrative? What realities does it erase? Because the most powerful stories aren't the ones we tell, they're the ones we unknowingly live by. From the first ochre strokes on cave walls to the viral memes flooding our screens, storytelling has been the invisible architect of civilization. Empires rose on epics like the Aeneid, which turned Roman conquest into divine destiny. Religions spread through parables that rewrote morality, from the Ten Commandments to the Jataka tales. Even our modern social norms, what we value, who we trust, how we govern, are built on ancient narratives that outlived the cultures that birthed them. The pharaohs knew it, the shamans mastered it, and today's influencers exploit it. Whoever controls the stories controls what feels true. But here's the pivot: recognizing these patterns doesn't just satisfy curiosity, it's armor against manipulation. When a politician invokes destiny or a brand spins a heroic origin myth, we're back in Babylon, where kings claimed gods etched their rights in stone. Neil Gaiman once said, "Stories are the way we make sense of the world. The flip side, they're also how others make sense of us, shaping our fears, loyalties, and even our memories." So what's the antidote? First, question the myths you're handed. Why does every nation teach its history as a series of triumphs? Why do corporate logos echo heraldic symbols? Second, reclaim the tools. Just as Aesop smuggled subversion into fables, we can dissect the stories sold to us, whether in ads, news, or politics, and ask who benefits. Now it's your turn. Drop your favorite ancient myth in the comments, maybe the Norse tale of Loki's chaos or Anansi's cleverness, and let's keep these conversations alive. Hit subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden strings of history, because understanding the past isn't just about knowledge, it's about pulling back the curtain on the stories still shaping us